Welcome. My name is Glenn Ingersoll. I work here, and this is a series called Clearly Meant. We invite a poet in the East Bay, usually Berkeley, to come and read for us, and then sit for an interview and discussion. So I hope if thoughts come up as the reading is proceeding, that you save them up for our discussion at the end. So we'll be spending about 20 minutes with the reading, about 20 minutes with the interview, and the final portion with however long we want to talk. I would like to let you know that we have Bruce Feingold's books in the collection. These are two of them. The third one is checked out. And all right. First, buy them from our author himself. He brought copies. I would like to welcome Bruce Feingold. I discovered his work reading anthologies of haiku, and in his little bio in the back it said he lived in Berkeley. So I was looking for poets who were doing different things, and I was happy to have someone who was doing haiku so well, so near, I could ask him over. So he's Bruce Feingold is currently the chair of the Haiku Foundation Touchstone Awards and vice president of the Haiku Poets of Northern California. He's published in haiku journals and anthologies from the United States to Europe and beyond. Bruce believes that haiku, like his work as a psychotherapist, is an art of the heart which taps our intelligence, creativity, openness, and honesty. As I said, we have 3 of his books in the collection, and he has some other materials that both to give away and to describe and to hopefully sell available. And I would like to welcome Bruce Feingold.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really glad to see everybody. And being a Warriors fan, I thought I'd give you start off with a haiku, the only haiku I ever wrote about basketball. It's based in Berkeley. The first half of the reading today, I'm going to read a lot of poems about Berkeley, celebrating our unique cultural and natural heritage. And this is based on a gym on the Berkeley-Oakland border, a small gym in the 1920s. And it goes, Sunday evening, the sound of pure net in the church gym. That's my hats off to the Warriors. You might have learned that haiku is an ancient nature Japanese short poem consisting of 575 syllables. We learned that in school. And it uses images to convey an experience linked with the human condition. Contemporary haiku isn't really concerned with syllable count very much. But we are really interested in how images connect and the juxtaposition of images and how they contrast or connect, so the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Oh boy. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's like pairing a good Cabernet with a steak. It creates a unique experience in its own way. So to celebrate Berkeley, as I said, I'm going to start the first half of the reading of poems from Berkeley over the last 25 years. Morning fog, the way it lingers with the forest. Tilt of a sparrow's head, green tea. Yoga, unfolding my mind. Startled puppy barks ferociously, aboriginal mask. Spring morning, my daughter breaks out skipping. Dow's record high, the Little League field overgrown with weeds. Cherry juice, the undocumented microbes of a field hand. There's tradition in haiku readings to read haiku twice. So some of these I may read twice for residents. I'll read this one again. Cherry juice, the undocumented microbes of a field hand. Here's a poem written a long time ago about the Oakland fire. Cool, starlit night, campus chimes carry the scent of a burnt hillside. Rain-swept streets, homeless trumpeters wail over the rainbow. Morning darkness so loud, I can't hear the robins. The transgender boy flips her tassel left to right, graduation morning. Haiku dad, I helped my daughter trim her college essay. Modern haiku also have a tradition the last 20 years of one-line haiku. And this is one written, it's a summer haiku. Squash and tomatoes, the sizzle of her satay. Summer twilight, my son chants the Kaddish for his guinea pig. Summer twilight, my son chants the Kaddish for his guinea pig. Home late, all our conversations from different rooms. This next haiku has been anthologized. It's one in the haiku world that has been reprinted a couple times. It took place in our neighborhood. Moonless night, my reclusive neighbor points out Jupiter. Moonless night, my reclusive neighbor points out Jupiter. Pickled daikon, a streak of autumn grass in my wife's hair. Now let's hit the road and do some traveling. Road trip. Everyone agrees on the Beatles. Step by step, my daughter and I climb the mountain mist. There's tradition in haiku of writing a new poem based on a prompt from a seasonal word. This goes back to the 17th century. And Basho, the founder of haiku, wrote, "Violets, how precious the mountain path." Violets, how precious on the mountain path. And here's my version. Half Dome, the wonder in the eye of a violet. You've probably seen Japanese scrolls with calligraphy and they have writing. A lot of those are haiku, and those are called haiga. And I was lucky to have a renowned contemporary haiku or haiga painter, and he did an anthology. He took one of my poems and made a haiga from it, and you can see it here, print it out, and you can see the. And the poem is old enough just to listen, trout rising. Old enough just to listen, trout rising. And that's a traditional haiku of the painting. This is inspired by a good friend. Moon in the pines, a tumbling creek, a friend beneath the stars. My dad has been a world traveler and turns 100 this year. And here's several poems from my dad. Travel itinerary, Dad lists all the villages where it can't be reached. An old man falters on the climb to the ruins, white morning glories. Summer haze, the lost timber of Dad's voice. When the kids were young, we went to Maui to connect with ourselves and slow down. Here's a group of poems from Maui written a long time ago. Tropical breeze, a banana face. Tropical breeze, a happy face on the banana slice. Questioning, the trade winds blow away the answers. Cutting her off, the New Yorker curses the SUV, even on Maui. This is a poem written in a classical 575. A golden sunset, I lie waiting on my board for the perfect wave. And this last poem from Maui I wrote when our daughter was a senior. It was during the summer, and it was our last hike on Maui before she was going off to college. Farewell hike, the windswept emptiness of Haleakala. About 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, I was really lucky to trek in Everest. Here's some poems from the Everest area. A fruit fly on Buddha's head, dawn departure. Kathmandu taxi, the bouncing head of a bobblehead Buddha. Trembling knees on the suspension bridge, prayer flags flutter. Mount Everest is so high at 29,000, there's this constant beautiful stream of clouds on it. Cloud wisps on Everest. After my stories, then what? Buddha eyes, a hunchback woman sweeps the temple steps. Inner vow, I'll bring home a laughing Buddha. Here's some haiku to close this half of the reading from my travels with my wife to Japan and Southeast Asia. Going to last 5-10 years. One of Basho's most personal haiku about aging and travel is this. Another year gone, hat in my hand, sandals on my feet. And here's my version. A new blue hat for my 7th decade. Autumn sunrise. Zen garden, every pebble has its place. Autumn stars, the white face of a geisha. You know, Japan still has incredible beauty and formality and respect. And on the cars and the train, when you leave, they bow. When the conductors take your ticket, they go to the end of the car and they bow. So morning dewdrops, the conductor bows, leaving each car. Busan, who's the next great haiku poet after Basho, lived in Kyoto, and one of his famous poems is this. Evening breeze, the water laps against the heron's legs. And here's my version. Evening breeze, a heron's reflection ripples near ground zero. It's Hiroshima. Another one from Hiroshima. Charred skin in a glass showcase, Hiroshima. Persimmon leaf plate, the things you remember years later. Another one-liner, every breath I become autumn. Next, we were in Vietnam and Cambodia, and the contrast between the past and future is really amazing. Winter dusk. Fishermen pull up their nets with flashes of squid. Ancient temple, the face of Buddha hacked off. Danyang security, no liquids, no dogs, and no grenades. Abandoned bunker, the young lovers snap a selfie. And finally, a final poem of this half from Cambodia. Water lilies, the floating kindness of Cambodia. No one were more kind and Buddhist than the Cambodian people. So the second half of the reading, I want to read a group of poems written over the last year and a half, of a lot of personal momentous changes in my life as well as public events, which I'm sure you'll recognize. And the name of this segment is Arrhythmia. It starts in Cusco. Cusco, golden plunder adorns the altar of Christ. Andean dusk, the dancer's shadows spread across the plaza. Milky Way, the last years of my life, the beginning of his. Altitude sickness, alone in my tent, dreaming of home. A Dead Woman's Pass is about 13,000 feet, and it's pretty steep. And I'm getting older. Dead Woman's Pass, my son doubles back to check on me. Highest I'll ever be, the sky unfolds into clouds and peaks. Contemporary haiku often do a lot of concrete poems. So here's, the Sun Gate is where the pilgrims, the Inca pilgrims, would go to the Sun Gate above Machu Picchu as part of the pilgrimage. And the last bit is incredibly steep. And of course, my son, being in the late 20s, he went up, and the guide said that I should crawl up. And he said it's a normal thing, it's a thing of respect for the Incas. So crawling on my hands and knees to the Sun Gate, Machu Picchu. Concrete poem. And the way it was really published, Machu Picchu was really tiny. It's like 1,000, 2,000 feet below the Sun Gate. Back home, the mountain quiet in his poems. And this is also a concrete poem. Zen garden, each rock a breath. First day back, The desk chair swivels to meet me. Dog days of August. The patient's childhood strikeouts. Expelled. The boy's eyes glaze over his parents' lecture. Expelled. The boy's eyes glaze over his parents' lecture. Country road through autumn fields bursting with refugees. It's also a one-liner. White picket fence. The suffragettes' daughter's Hillary sign. I start crying. And this is a contemporary haiku. It's a little more abstract. It's more of an avant-garde one. Andy Warhol soup cans. Donald Trump connecting the dots. Contemporary haiku is often use a lot of pun and wordplay and single line ones, and these two are. First one is ego testicle, and I didn't write that about Donald Trump. I wrote that quite a while ago. And the next one, successful. So I guess in the Me Too movement. On a more serious note, insomnia. I keep waking up in 1930s Germany. Before we say good morning, the electoral map. The flying crows from Van Gogh's Madness, Dark Blue Autumn. Post-election, how are you now begins with, but? Time out. My wife restricts me from MSNBC. Arrhythmia, the unraveling of the republic. The gentle squeeze of a blood pressure cuff, ICU. Heartbeat, now you see it, now you don't. White light, an angel cradles my heart with her wings. A rampipe is a Canadian slang for a dead tree, a splintered tree by lightning. Rampike, medicine restarts my heart. Everyone gone, the rise and fall of an EKG. Mount Everest, dreaming of the peaks I'll never climb. Whiteboard, the doctor's quick sketch of an aorta. Winter dusk, another night in the hospital. This is for you, Emily, inspired by your text. Angioplasty, my daughter-in-law texts emoji hearts. And dawn's first light, yellow chrysanthemum in a vase. Anesthesia, the last leaf lets go. Defibrillator, my daughter calls me bionic dad. Moss between stepping stones, a path home. And the first night out for me in the hospital, the first week or two, Sue and her son, they hosted Christmas dinner. And I wrote this from that dinner. Arctic winds, friends toast to freedom. Mm-hmm. Winter attic, our cold feet touch under the quilt. Dropping a quarter in a homeless woman's palm, cold fingers touching. River tide, rushing towards the sea, New Year's morning. This is also a one-liner. Just being the ocean breeze. Orion's belt, the globe spins me again. January unfolding. My dad's pill cutter, now mine. Fallen redwoods, the solitary walks after illness. Emerald hills, how little rain it takes for hope to grow. This is our final big rains for the drought. The scar slowly healing, wildflowers. You know, poets and writers were always trying to express things, and I was trying to express the beauty of yellow. And the poem goes like this. Buttercups at high noon, yellow squared. Coming of summer, the whiteness of roses. A swallowtail brushes my fingertips, warrior pose. She straightens her brother's wedding tie, late summer rain. Restored foundry. The kids were married in Brooklyn. Restored foundry. A couple holds hand under a hookah. Staying alive. The groom's parents revise their disco moves. My son mans the barbecue grill. Labor Day. Scampi. Scooping sweet meat from the shell. And a final meditation, poems. Freud's oceanic oneness, washing my body with seaweed soap. Better than, less than, no than. Storm passes, the transparency inside a raindrop. A proboscis in the heart of a blossom, gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was delightful. A lot of charm in the poems, and a lot of emotional range too. I mean, there was a lot of laughter in the last section, but there was a lot of seriousness too, and that was a lot of separate poems. That wasn't one poem which you read over an extended period, and some of them went by fast. You have to listen.
Yeah.
And I can understand the read it twice idea, because they do go by fast, and if you're still contemplating the last one, you might miss the next one. But that happens in everyday life too. You know, it's like if you're paying attention, you catch only a small fraction of what's going on. That's one of the things that about haiku that's intriguing for me is the not just the smallness, but the attempt to evoke a much largerness. You talk about how you go about creating your haiku.
That's a question?
Yeah.
It happens a couple of ways for me. And I'm very interested in the creative process and creative flow. I mean, some haiku just write themselves. The angioplasty, my daughter-in-law texts, emoji hearts, I don't know if it was before or after the angioplasty, but it just came to me. And so some of those come really quickly. Others, I'll write a fragment of it, and then I'll spin on or think about it, and something will come out. Some are more constructed, like the Donald Trump one about connecting dots, the Andy Warhol's soup cans. Originally, I'd written a poem about my son, who's not here. He has an event he was at for a friend, bachelor party thing. And he's a brand analyst, and I was trying to write a poem about being a brand analyst. And I was thinking about Donald Trump, and I must have seen an Andy Warhol exhibit, and I kind of put them together. And I was thinking about the dots of Andy Warhol. I was thinking about branding and how he's a master of that. And so it was really a constructed poem over time. And it started in another direction, because I was really trying to write a poem about the irony of a Berkeley kid becoming a brand analyst, which I didn't really write that poem, and never really came out. So I do construct them in that way.
That sounds like an example you talk in your reading, your talk. You described the juxtaposition of images. So leaving up to the reader, to the listener, connecting dots there. These are two images, connect them.
And you know, what the haiku literature really talks about is how much the two images, if they're too close together and they're too similar, you sort of say, oh, okay, you don't have much meaning. If they're too far apart, the reader or listener can't connect the dots. So there's that balance between being too obvious or too obscure. And the other thing that people talk a lot about in the haiku world is how to keep poems open so you don't close them off so they have multiple interpretations and sort of an open and resonant kind of poems. And I think sometimes I do that well. I think sometimes I'm whimsical and I think I close them off a little bit. That would be my own critique. But the idea is to really keep them open to multiple layers is sort of the gold standard.
You've brought some handouts about haiku. You're talking about the haiku world. I encourage people who haven't seen them to pick up contact information, descriptions. I'm going to keep one. And that's one of the things too that makes haiku somewhat separate from generic poetry world is these organizations that promote this particular kind of poetry. Can you?
There's a very active national organization, the Haiku Society of America, and they have a lot of local chapters all over the country, and really, and there are a lot of big haiku movement in Britain, Europe. There's Africa has a new haiku journal in the last 5 years. India has got a very strong, active community, as does Eastern Europe. They're writing some incredible poems about the tragedies in Eastern Europe. The haiku movement would like to integrate more into the mainstream poetry movement, and there's a lot of movement to encourage haiku poets to submit more to regular journals, which is happening more. And there are some really well-known mainstream poets who are very big in the haiku. Kerouac and Ginsberg have quite a body of haiku. Richard Wilbur and Billy Collins, who's been the poet laureate. I don't know if he's been the Pulitzer, I don't think he's won a Nobel Prize, but he writes quite a few haiku. So there are some of those poems. Jane Hirschfield's another who writes a fair amount of haiku. So there are some mainstream poets who are writing haiku. Robert Haas has translated, our local poet and poet laureate, has translated haiku and writes some in his collected volumes.
Can you talk about how you got into haiku in the first place?
You know, when I was 40, my friend Jack's son gave me Basho's seminal work, Journey to the Deep North, something like that. And I was really struck by it. And I've written a fair amount of free verse and published a fair amount of free verse in my 30s and 20s. But with kids and work, I thought, oh, I could do this. I can write 16 or 17 syllables or 12 words. And so that's how it kind of started. And I like wordplay, and so it happened like that. And I started, and the first haiku that got published in Modern Haiku, which is one of the real seminal, it goes like this. It was written pretty spontaneously, driving one early morning and seeing a vulture in the sky. And it goes, traveling alone, a vulture floats in a pale sky, the half moon glowing. And that was the first haiku I published. It was a classic 575.
Could you repeat it?
Traveling alone, a vulture floats in a pale sky, a half moon glowing. I was literally driving down 880, and it was early in the morning, and I was flying off, I think, to spring training. And there was vultures flying around, there was a half moon, day moon, or night moon, and I wrote that poem. And that was the first poem that was published in 20 years ago, no more than that, 25, 26 years ago.
And then at what point did you join organizations?
Probably a couple years after
Not
that.
long after that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been more active in the local, as the kids have gotten older, I've had more time. I only rarely went before, even though I was a member of the local organization, would publish in it. But it was really when the kids got older and had more time between work and family that I go regularly now and participate. And we meet every quarter in San Francisco at Fort Mason. We meet on the seasons, and we host a very well-known, it's the longest standing haiku reading in the United States, outside of Japan. It's the longest standing, it's about 2 autumns reading, and it's in late August. And I have a bunch of chapbooks from it that are free over the last 5 or 6 or 10 years. And it's a wonderful, we do four people read, and we have a lot of good food, and it's a nice event. And, writing for it, basically.
A lot of haiku theory has been written, and I've read a fair amount. I don't claim to have any great expertise on it or anything, but do you write prose about haiku as well?
I've written a couple essays about specific poems where I've done some critique of, probably once every couple of years I've published some short pieces analyzing poems.
There seemed to be, when I first was trying to write my haiku post and send them to places, I think I sent to Modern Haiku.
Yeah.
And I got some nice letters back, but I didn't get anything included in the magazine. The number of rules for what is and is not a haiku feels like that's relaxed over the years.
It has relaxed.
But it was very, I don't know, at the time, it was intimidating how much you need to know to write such a tiny poem.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the two most well-known journals are Modern Haiku and Frog Pond. Frog Pond is the journal of the Haiku Society of America, and they get a couple thousand. Modern Haiku publishes 100 haiku every 3 times a year, something like that. And they get how many submissions? A couple thousand.
Sure.
So it's a lot. So that's one thing. It's very hard. Those journals are very hard to and in terms of the rules, I think the thing that really, as I said earlier, the idea of having images and to show, don't tell, let it resonate with the reader, and having contrasting images. That's one of the rules, so to speak. The other one is really a cutting word. The idea in the Japanese poem, they actually had little phrases or words that would cut phrases. And we don't really have those, we use punctuation, but the idea is to have often the first 2 lines, or sometimes the first line, and then you cut with the rhythm of the words and the images, so you really contrast. So that's really important. Season words, again, in traditional haiku, they all had season words, but now we do a lot of senru, comic things, and if the poem works, people aren't really concerned if it has like a season word. And of course, the Japanese tradition, they have a long dictionary of a tradition. So cherry blossoms is always a certain month or 2 in Japan. And persimmon leaf is always in the fall. So it's very homogeneous. And of course, in our world, we have daffodils, in March? And of course, daffodils don't happen until, May or June in the East. So we have a much more varied landscape. But you don't need a season word anymore, even though there's a lot of arguments about season words or no season words. But the idea is to get something that really contrasts and shifts and gets going in the reader in that more intuitive way. So that's those sort of basic rules.
Do you have favorite haiku poets?
Let's see, Chuck Ridgely's here today, and Chuck is a great haiku poet. He's one of the great, there's a lot of divides. A lot of people writing more urban, edgy, contemporary stuff. A lot of people still writing more nature, and Chuck is more one of the ones, as I am somewhat more heartfelt, heart-oriented, and nature-oriented. Some local poets are really great. Susan Antolin, who's in Walnut Creek, is one of the really writes some of the most beautiful personal poems. As a real master. Faye Aoji, thank you. Faye is the president of the Haiku Society of America, and she is Japanese born and one of the most contemporary, modern poets who really stretches the imagination, and she's wonderful. Oh gosh, there's so many. Spacing out, but those are some that come to mind.
Do you have any thoughts for someone interested in beginning to write haiku?
I would encourage you to
learning
write,
from
not to
others?
censor, and to write. The Haiku Society does have a mentor program where you can online get mentoring. I encourage you to read a lot. Again, there's a lot of free material here. I think the more you read, you get that rhythm of it. And not to be discouraged. I mean, I certainly get a lot of rejections. Heron's Nest is one of the online journals that's very selective, and they publish, I think, 3 times a year. And if I get one in, I feel like I've conquered Mount Everest. So there are journals that are really tough to get into, but I think writing a lot. And I think coming to the meetings, in our meetings, we'll read out loud. We'll start, usually have a reader for 20 minutes, and then usually do a workshop where we'll do a writing workshop. So that's a great way to both connect, see what's going on in the community, but also practice haiku. And there's a lot, the groups are a really great group. Some Gary Gay, Carolyn Hall, these are some of the real haiku superstars in the Bay Area. And they're all really good teachers, and it's a great place to learn. And,
It's great to hear about that kind of resource. You described in the bio you sent me this the line, an art of the heart which taps our intelligence, creativity, openness, and honesty. So it sounds like in the context of one's life, not just as a separate art, what does haiku do?
I think for me, it's a form of expression. It's when I write haiku, it helps me crystallize a moment, a sense of understanding of what's going on, whether internally, externally, as well as connecting with the natural world. So for me, it's a very peaceful art, as well as connecting art to understand something. And it takes that moment and it gives it resonance inside. And then I do like to write about political things. You see a lot of the Donald Trump poems, the refugee poems, and trying to stay socially conscious. And there's a lot of discussion in the haiku world about being too political, not political enough, being too abstract, conceptual, like the Donald Trump one is more of abstract haiku versus writing more heartfelt haiku, more about personal stuff. And the problem with that, after a while, what happens, and the nature haiku, they get kind of boring. I mean, I read 3 or 4, 5, 6 journals regularly and online, and there's some beautiful nature haiku, but after a while, it's easy to get sort of lost in them. So it's how do you keep finding meaning? So I really like those poems that are clearly without the self in there and clearly nature-oriented. But you read a lot; they have to resonate. I'll read you, for example, the famous one. Basho's really first big breakthrough poem. So there's no self in here, and it's one of his most well-known. On a bare branch, a crow is perched, autumn evening. So there's no self there. It's just an image of this crow in autumn evening, and it resonates. And what does that mean? And when you read haiku literature, there's hundreds of interpretations of what that poem's about. But it's certainly about a sense of aloneness, or what in Japanese they call sabi. And I'll read it again. On a bare branch, a crow is perched, autumn evening. And so again, no sense of self, totally nature, but clearly about being alone, being a human being. And I'll give you another idea. So here's another one of there's a more personal haiku, also written by Busan. And the irony about this poem, we talked about the creative process. His wife actually wasn't alive when he wrote this. And this is very personal haiku. So we think of haiku being very nature-oriented, but here's one written in the 17th century. He was from Kyoto. The piercing chill I feel, my dead wife's comb in our bedroom under my heel. Well, his wife was actually alive. He was creative here. But there's not, I guess there's the piercing chill, maybe it's a winter haiku.
Speculative fiction.
Speculative fiction, yes. But it's also very sensory, because one of the things that's great about this haiku, you feel that comb under your heel, and everyone can grimace and feel that. So again, very sensory, very image-based, but more, and very deep, but certainly not particularly a seasonal haiku, as the crow one by Basho.
Well, I'm going to open up for discussion. I appreciate the one-on-one, but let's see if anybody else has some things to ask or say.
A question. Do you speak or read Japanese? Like you
I don't.
Like the original traditional?
No, I don't.
Okay. So everything is in English?
Everything's in English, yeah.
Would you travel in Japan?
I have traveled to Japan. And I got thank you and a couple of words. That was arigato.
Did you make a connection when you were in Japan with?
We did. There's a
poets?
really well-known English professor, who's an Englishman, whose name is David Burley, and he teaches in Japan. And he's a real well-known haiku poet and also a critic. And he actually is friend with a friend of ours, and they hosted a dinner in a pre-war home in Tokyo. Which there aren't many of those left.
Yeah.
And he had beautiful pottery. He's a pottery collector from the 17th, 18th century, and David was there. Next time we go back, I want to do more. I'd like to go to Basho's hut, and there's a haiku museum, which we missed.
Oh, and I want to let everybody know that I still have a few copies of the chapbook, so if you need one, you can reach for one right now or catch me afterwards.
Yeah.
Thanks for the reading, that was wonderful. In terms of your creative process, could you say a little bit more about that? So for example, if you're out in nature or have a conversation with somebody and something sparks your interest and you work on the idea, or how does that work for you?
Well, with people stuff, it's often happens pretty quickly. Like the one, I'm a psychologist, and one of my specialties is teenagers, and the one expelled, the boy's eyes glaze over his parents' lecture. Well, I'm sitting in the room, and the guy is like this, and that one was like, I may have played with the language to get like a lot of the S sounds. I may have played around a little bit. So those happen. One of my weaknesses is I'm not great. Some people, Gary Gay, for example, a couple of poets, they take walks and come up with these great nature poems. And that happens for me sometimes, but I just find it's really beautiful, but I can't, it's hard for me to find the contrast in some of those. I do write those, but they tend to be personal, like the fallen redwoods. After I was ill and I was walking in Redwood Creek, and the redwoods were fallen. I really wanted to write poems about redwoods, but I've not been very successful. But that one, the redwoods were down. I was taking this walk. Actually, I think I was you with my daughter or my friend Jack. I'm not sure it was solitary, but it made it a better poem. And I did have a lot of solitary time. So that one, Fallen Redwoods, Solitary Walks After My Illness. So that's a mixed one. It's got a lot of person in it, so it's certainly not totally objective like The Crow, but it's certainly in nature. And then on the other hand, the buttercups at high noon, yellow squared, that was totally a nature one where I was really trying to, it was a beautiful spring day, it was a Briones, and the buttercups are up there regularly in March, and I was trying to get the beauty of yellow and struck by it. And so that one happened, and I've done some other haiku with notations like square, not the first one to do that, but I sort of added my twist to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have a book that you write in? Do you, like, what's that process?
I do, it's funny, I used to always have a journal by my bed, and I still do, but I have a confession that I write most of them on my phone or my iPad. I do scribble now and then, I still write, and I write in the journal, but most of it's in the iPad, and then I send it to then I go in my desktop and I put it in a long list.
Is it immediate when you think of it, or is
Yeah,
it?
usually. And sometimes I'll be there at night and I'll try to be sort of quiet, meditative, and like I was thinking about this little boy, this teenager getting expelled, and that sad moment with the parents, and I sat by my iPad and I wrote it, so it happens like that. Or sometimes after being out in nature, something like that. Or the moonless night with the reclusive neighbor pointing at Jupiter. I think it was a neighborhood night out, and he had one of those big scopes out, and he pointed out Jupiter. And I came home and it just sort of hit me. That was probably a long time. That was probably 7, 8 years ago. I probably wrote that one down, read on the iPad.
Everyone here written haiku, or some people? Any?
We have Jerry Ball's Rossmore's.
Jerry Ball is a Dogen, and our
our mentor at Rossmore and in a haiku group in originally Barnes and Noble, which left some months ago. But he established the Southern California Haiku Study Group years ago when he was down there, and you can speak for yourself, I don't know. But just to introduce him.
And Jerry's written a lot of great haiku. One of my favorite, Jerry's written probably the best volume, maybe, of baseball haiku.
You want to hear a baseball haiku?
Sure. I would, yeah. There you go.
Oh, it's
My
illustrated.
son did the illustration.
Oh.
There's some pretty good ones.
You want to read just one?
Alone in the dugout, the boy who threw the last pitch of the season.
One's getting published, and this came from, I think, this is the baseball haiku that I just wrote. I think it came from I think a ball game at the A's, and it's very simple. Summer twilight, a long fly ball settles into his glove. And when you read the journals, there's always be modern haiku, frog pond. There's usually one or two baseball haiku. Not many football haiku, not many basketball, but a fair amount of baseball haiku. Baseball's rural and it's quiet.
I have a question. Is there any Japanese tradition of anything aside from nature, like battle or athletics, or is that just all art?
You know, one of the readings I did a couple years ago, someone joked that haiku writers don't write about aggression and anger very much. But you know, from like in Europe, from Southeast Europe, from Yugoslavia, those poets are writing incredibly about war. There's actually a whole genre on Hiroshima haiku. There's a lot of haiku that came out of the concentration camps in California, what are they called? The internment camps. So there is some of that. And some of the more edgy younger people are writing some really, Chase Gagnon's one who's a young guy who's been on the streets, and he's writing some really edgy haiku about urban world and much more things like that. Here's a baseball haiku that I wrote quite a while ago. Sinking sun, a curve in the dirt strikes out the schoolyard bully. My family will know. So.
I like that strikeout.
Do you make much attempt to memorize your haiku?
Well, I guess when I do readings, I pretty much they get encoded.
Sure.
Yeah. It's more. And it's great, it's only a few words. It's a lot easier than long. Yeah.
May I share a poem I wrote a few minutes ago?
Please.
Haiku reading, a butterfly tapping on the window pane.
Lovely.
In the moment, sensual. It states it gives a really open interpretation. It's a nice haiku. And did that come spontaneously? I know it was a white cap.
Yes, I just saw that.
Yeah.
Was that something you did just now?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a white cap butterfly.
I realized that you were
Yeah.
offering something. You were just excellent. Are there any questions you feel like that were hanging? That I should
No, I
ask?
can't think of any offhand.
Okay, well, I appreciate everyone having come. Do hang out a little bit and check out what Bruce Feingold has brought for us. And visit among yourselves. And I hope you watch for our next reading. I don't yet know who the poet is going to be, but we do this 3 times a year, so not very often, but often enough that keeps me busy.
So there's, Mariposa is the twice-a-year journal of the local haiku society. There's ones going back quite a while, 10, 15 years, and a bunch of contemporary ones. And then Frog Pond is the Haiku Society's haiku journal. It also has essays and book reviews, so it's quite eclectic. And then there's, from the 2 Autumns readings, there are 4 or 5 chapbooks there, and then there's a handout that I wrote for a conference with a pretty leaf from Japan. Thank you.